Welcome back to the deep dive. We are really glad you're here today because we are looking at a stack of research that essentially tells the origin story of modern Europe.
Hmm.
And I don't mean the treaties or, the borders on the map. I mean the people.
Right. It's a massive topic. We are looking at a demographic shift that moved 15 million people in just a few decades.
Yeah. And that number 15 million, that's the hook for me. The source material highlights that by the 1980s, immigrants made up 5% of the total European population.
Which is huge.
Right. That is not a small margin of error. That is a fundamental alteration of the continent's DNA.
It really is. And the sources we have today, spanning economic reports, sociological studies, political analysis, they paint a picture of how Europe went from this desperate labor shortage to what many scholars now describe as a cultural identity crisis.
It's a bit of a roller coaster, to be honest.
Yeah, it is.
We start with the economic miracle, we go through the guest worker phase, and we end up with the rise of nationalist politics. So the mission today for you listening is to connect those dots. How did a math problem turn into a culture war?
That is the central question.
Yeah.
And to understand the end of the story, we really have to start at the beginning. The setting is post-World War II.
Right. The war is over.
Exactly.
The continent is physically devastated, but then, and the research emphasizes this heavily, the recovery kicks in much faster than anyone predicted.
It was explosive. We call it the economic miracle.
Yeah.
Factories are coming back online, infrastructure is being rebuilt, the service sector is waking up, the economy is just hungry.
It needs to be fed labor.
Yes, it needs hands.
But this is where we had the first snag in the research, the demographic paradox.
Right. It sounds complicated, but it's actually quite simple. At the exact moment the economic engine is revving up and demanding millions of workers, the native European population is doing two things.
Aging and shrinking.
Exactly. It's aging and it's shrinking. The birth rates were declining.
So you have a high demand for sweat and muscle, but the supply of young, able-bodied domestic workers is just flatlining.
The bodies just weren't there.
Now, I have to play devil's advocate here because I'm looking at the notes on social changes during this exact time. This is also the era of the second wave of feminism.
Yes, it is.
Women are entering the workforce in record numbers. Why didn't that close the gap?
It's a great question. And it did help. The female participation rate skyrocketed. But the data shows the gap was it was too cavernous.
It wasn't enough.
No. Even with half the population entering the workforce in a new way, the industrial machine was growing so fast that domestic labor simply couldn't keep up. It was a mathematical impossibility to fill those jobs locally.
So Europe has a crisis of success. Too much work, not enough people. This brings us to the solution. The governments get together and come up with a plan.
The guest worker system.
I've always found that term fascinating. Guest worker. It feels very polite,
Very polite.
but also very temporary.
That is the key insight right there. The language was highly deliberate. The governments, Germany, France, the UK, they viewed this as a transaction.
Like a contract.
Precisely. The attitude was, we need labor for 10 years to rebuild. You come, you work, you make money, and then you go home. It was designed as a rotation, not an immigration.
It sounds like they were trying to order labor from a catalog.
In a way, yes. They wanted the labor power without necessarily wanting the citizen.
But people need to come from somewhere. And the map of where they came from is really interesting because it wasn't random. The research calls this the imperial parents dynamic.
Right.
Can we break that down? Because that sounds like a psychology term, but it's geopolitical.
It is entirely geopolitical. Think about it this way. Migration follows the path of least resistance. If you were going to move your entire life to a new continent, where do you go?
You go where you speak the language.
Exactly. You go where the legal system makes sense to you. You go where you might already have a cousin or a contact.
So this ties directly back to decolonization.
Directly. As the European empires dissolved in the 50s and 60s, the flow of people reversed. Instead of Europeans going to the colonies to rule or extract resources, people from the former colonies moved to the imperial parent.
Okay, let's get specific with the examples from the text. Let's start with the UK.
The UK is probably the clearest example of this. You saw massive migration from India, Pakistan, and the Caribbean.
Because they were Commonwealth citizens.
Right. They grew up in systems modeled on the British one. They spoke English. The path to London or Birmingham was, in a sense, already paved by history.
It's like the empire coming home.
That's exactly what it was. And then you look at France.
Right, France had a massive empire in Africa.
France looks south across the Mediterranean, North Africa, Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, These were former French territories.
I think Algeria was even legally considered part of France for a long time.
It was. So when the French car manufacturers like Renault needed assembly line workers, that's where they went to recruit.
It makes total sense. It's the path of least resistance. But the notes also point out that not all migration came from outside Europe. There was a lot of movement happening inside the house, so to speak.
That's a crucial distinction. We often fixate on the global south, but the internal intra-European migration was huge. It was a flow from the agrarian south to the industrial north.
And Germany is the main character in that story.
Germany was the engine room of Europe. They needed the most people by far. So they absorbed hundreds of thousands of Italian, Greek, Spanish, and Portuguese workers.
And Turkish workers too, right? That was a big part of the German strategy.
Yes, Turkey is a unique case geographically, sitting right on the bridge between Europe and Asia, but it fits the pattern. Germany brought in millions of Turkish Gastarbeiters.
Yes, workers.
Right. And again, the idea was temporary. They lived in dormitories near the factories. They were there to work, not become German citizens.
So let's just pause and look at the scoreboard for the 50s and 60s. On paper, this is working flawlessly. The factories are staffed, the GDP is climbing, and the immigrants are sending remittances home. Everyone wins.
Economically, yes. It was a highly successful arrangement. The economic miracle was entirely fueled by this labor.
And there is always but in history, human beings are messy. You can't just import labor like you import steel or coal.
No, you can't.
And that transitions us into the cultural transformation.
There's a famous quote from Max Frisch, a Swiss playwright, that sums up this entire era better than any data point. He said, "We asked for workers. We got people instead."
Man, that hits hard. It really encapsulates the oversight.
It does. The government's planned for hands to operate machines. They didn't plan for families, for schools, for mosques, for different cuisines, or for the complex social needs of actual human beings.
And even plan for neighbors.
Exactly. And because the rotation didn't happen, people ended up staying. They had children. The demographics shifted permanently.
And the research flags one specific cultural shift that really challenged the status quo, which is religion, specifically the rise of Islam.
This was the most profound change. Post-war migration made Islam the second largest religion in Europe. Now, consider the context of that. For centuries, Europe had been a relatively homogeneous Christian continent.
Catholic or Protestant, basically.
Right.
And increasingly secular, too. Or at least the relationship between church and state had been settled for a long time.
Settled, yes. And specifically in places like France, that secularism is aggressive. It's not just that the state doesn't have a religion, it's that the public sphere is supposed to be entirely free of religion.
So suddenly, you have a significant minority population practicing a faith that the average European knew very little about. It wasn't just a private change happening in living rooms. It started to manifest in the public sphere.
And that's where the friction starts. The notes discuss the headscarf controversy as a prime example of this. This wasn't just about fashion, it became a huge political debate.
Can we unpack that? Because to an outsider, it might just look like a dress code issue. Why was it such a flashpoint?
It was a proxy war for a much larger issue. In France, they have a rigid secularism. The state is supposed to be perfectly neutral. No religious symbols in public institutions.
Okay, so when a young girl wears a traditional head covering to a public school,
the state sees it as a direct challenge to its neutrality. They view the school as a place to make French citizens, not to display religious affiliation.
But the families obviously see it as a basic right to religious expression.
Right, and it sparked a massive debate that the sources highlight. Should religious practices bend to national laws, or should national laws accommodate religious practices?
It's a clash of fundamental values. It's really about who adapts to whom.
Precisely. And it wasn't just about clothing or visibility, it was about political access, too. The integration experience varied wildly across the continent.
How so?
Well, in some countries, immigrants and their children could run for office and participate in civic life fairly easily. In others, there were huge barriers. Citizenship tests, residency requirements that effectively locked them out of the democratic process.
So we have this building pressure. But the economy is booming, which acts as a buffer, right? People tend to be more tolerant when their wallets are full.
Always.
But then we hit the 1970s.
The turning point.
The vibe shifts completely. The research points to an economic downturn that just changes all the rules of the game.
It was the end of the economic miracle. We moved into a global recession. The oil crisis hits, industrial output slows down, and for the first time in decades, unemployment starts to tick up.
And when the jobs disappear, what happens to the guest worker narrative?
It evaporates overnight. The entire justification for their presence was economic necessity. We need them because we have too many jobs. Once the jobs are gone, the welcome mat gets pulled away very quickly.
And this is where the scapegoating begins.
Unfortunately, yes. It's a pattern we see throughout history. When the native population starts feeling economic pain, they look for a cause, and the easiest target is the outsider.
So the narrative flips from they are helping us rebuild to they are taking our jobs.
Exactly. It
Whoop.
became highly personal. I can't pay my rent because they are here.
And this social grumbling didn't stay at the dinner table. It organized. Which leads us to the political backlash.
Right, the rise of nationalism. This wasn't just a mood anymore. It became a political platform.
The economic stagnation of the 70s and 80s really provided the fuel for extreme nationalist and conservative parties. They realized that anti-immigrant rhetoric was a powerful vote-getter.
Let's look at the case studies in the notes. First up, France and the National Front.
The National Front is the archetype for this. The sources show they emerged as a serious force during that downturn. Their platform was blunt. France, for the French, cut off immigration, send people back, restrict assimilation.
Now, for you listening who might not follow French political history, did they win? Did the National Front take the presidency during this period?
No, they didn't win the big share. But, and this is a really important concept the expert notes highlight, they shifted the Overton window.
Break that down for us. What is the Overton window?
Think of a window that looks out onto a landscape of ideas. The ideas inside the window are the ones that mainstream politicians are willing to talk about without sounding crazy to the public.
Right.
The ideas outside the window are considered too extreme.
Okay, so how did the National Front change that?
By taking a hardline, extreme stance and actually getting a decent chunk of the vote, say 15 or 20%, the National Front moved that window. They made ideas that used to be considered extreme seem normal.
So the mainstream parties look at those votes and say, we need to get those people back.
Exactly. To stop their voters from defecting to the National Front, the mainstream conservative parties started adopting tougher policies on immigration just to keep them. So even though the National Front didn't win the executive election, they won the argument. They pulled the whole political spectrum in their direction.
That is fascinating. You don't need to be in power to change the policy. You just need to be loud enough and popular enough to scare the people in power.
Correct. Influence is sometimes way more powerful than holding office. Now, contrast that with our second example from the deep dive today, the Freedom Party in Austria.
How are they different?
The rhetoric was very similar, protecting national identity, deep skepticism of outsiders. But the Freedom Party was more institutionally successful. They didn't just influence the conversation, they actually got people elected to high office.
They became part of the governing coalition.
Yes, which shows that in Central Europe, this wasn't just a fringe movement shouting from the sidelines. It had deep roots. It demonstrated that a significant portion of the electorate was willing to vote specifically on the issue of stopping or reversing migration.
And this wasn't just a blip. This really set the stage for the politics we see in Europe today.
Absolutely. The arguments being made in the 80s and 90s regarding national identity and borders are the exact same arguments being made today. The players change, but the script remains the same.
So when we zoom out and look at this whole period from 1950 to 2000, it feels like a total transformation.
It is. If you fell asleep in Europe in 1945 and woke up in 2000, you wouldn't recognize the social fabric at all.
No, you wouldn't.
Europe went from being a collection of largely homogenous Christian societies to a highly complex, pluralistic, multi-faith continent.
And it seems like that tension we talked about earlier never really went away.
No, it's the defining feature of the era. It's a constant clash between two massive forces. On one side, you have the economic necessity. Europe's economy would have completely collapsed or stagnated without that foreign labor. It was an absolute requirement.
Right. And on the other side,
The cultural backlash. The societies just weren't prepared for the speed and scale of the change. They wanted the labor without the life.
which brings us to the final thought for today's deep dive. The source material keeps coming back to this idea that the guest worker programs were meant to be a temporary fix, like a patch on a flat tire.
But you can't patch a society.
Right. It raises a massive question for anyone listening. We tend to put economics in one box and culture in another box. We talk about GDP over here, and then we talk about identity over there.
But this history proves that they are completely fused. You cannot separate them.
So the question to leave you with is this. Can a nation ever truly separate its economic needs from its cultural identity? Or are they inevitably bound together the exact moment a worker crosses a border?
That is the question Europe is still trying to answer today. And looking at the data, it's not a question that has an easy answer.
It definitely isn't.
And on that heavy note, we are going to wrap up this deep dive. It is a wildly complex history, and we really only scratched the surface today, but hopefully this gives you a clearer picture of how the Europe we see on the news today was actually built.
It was a pleasure to unpack it.
Thanks for listening. We will catch you on the next deep dive.